Here's the latest worldwide news from the American Entertainment Network. Bill Deal reporting. The final hours of Skylab as the big space station heads for a death dive, which likely will take it away from North America and other land areas. ABC's Tony Sargent is at the Johnson Space Center in Houston. Tony, how far away are we to Skylab's fall? What do the people say at Mission Control?
Bill, they say it's going to come down 2.5 hours or so from now, give or take a little bit either way. It is still 80 statute miles up over the South Pacific, passing Australia. It has less than 2 orbits to go now, and as you mentioned, NASA still believes that it will clear the North American continent on its final crucial orbit of the Earth and will land somewhere in the Atlantic. Bill?
NASA officials have estimated about 2/3 of the space station will burn up in the atmosphere. About 500 pieces weighing more than 20 tons are expected to survive. And how will space officials know where Skylab falls? Joe Mitchell, who heads the Federal Preparedness Agency, tells us.
If it does not hit in the United States and hits at sea, we intend to get reports from any ships at sea, the United States Coast Guard, or any foreign carriers who may call in to our location here to report on sightings. So we will be taking sightings if it does not impact on the continental United States.
Mitchell says that it's very possible there might not be any sightings at all of Skylab debris. Stay tuned to this station for continuing Skylab updates. Now,
CBS News. The Joint Chiefs of Staff are not enthusiastic about SALT II. This is Dallas Townsend reporting on the CBS Radio Network. Within the next 2 hours, Skylab is expected to re-enter the Earth's atmosphere. Jed Duval reports from NASA headquarters in Washington.
NASA has narrowed the time and space for Skylab's fall. The eyes of the trackers are now on a long curving line that begins north of Seattle, Washington, makes a gentle arc across the Canadian border, goes south of Lake Winnipeg in Manitoba, cuts off the top of Maine, nips Nova Scotia, and then goes southeast across the Atlantic Ocean. This line represents what's expected to be Skylab's finish. NASA hopes Skylab will have enough momentum to carry all its debris out to sea, but acknowledges that some of the smaller pieces could fall along that line in Canada and in Maine. While the predicted re-entry is now just before noon Eastern Daylight Time, trackers are expected to come up with a new prediction momentarily, hoping that a new time will be a precious 10 or 15 minutes later, the time needed to push even the small pieces into the Atlantic Ocean. Even if the present prediction does not change, the heavy sections of Skylab are expected to be hundreds of miles out into the water. Meantime, the Federal Aviation Administration says that in a few moments from now, it will begin diverting aircraft 75 miles on either side of that long, curved line. This is Jed Duval, CBS News at NASA headquarters in Washington. NASA has just announced a new set of predictions, and Skylab has apparently picked up a precious 18.5 minutes, what trackers were hoping they would get. The final line of re-entry for Skylab within 2 hours is expected to cross Seattle, across the lowest part of Canada, across Nova Scotia, and into the Atlantic Ocean. There was a fear that the smallest pieces would drop on land, but having picked up an additional 18 minutes of life, it looks now as if Skylab will drop entirely, all the little pieces, into the Atlantic Ocean, and of course the heavy pieces too. Jed Duval, CBS News, at NASA headquarters in Washington.
About a 4,000-mile stretch, 100 miles wide, of various debris. The more dangerous particles will land on downrange. This would all take place, little more than an hour and a half from now if NASA's predictions are correct. Stay with us for updates on Skylab from Mission Control in Houston.
This is KGNB Radio 142 New Braunfels. This has been Update on Skylab. And you say...
Here's the latest worldwide news from the American Entertainment Network. Gary Nunn reporting. The come down of Skylab. ABC's Mike Von Fremd has an update from NASA headquarters in Washington.
Skylab is now expected to fall in just about 2 hours. and that's good news. For if these latest projections are correct, the debris will land in the Atlantic around the equator. Some of the pieces expected to run into the thousands of pounds. Earlier projections had put some of the debris coming down just off the coast of Maine. These new estimates put Skylab further into the ocean. Mike Von Fremd, ABC News, NASA headquarters in Washington.
Thank you, Mike. ABC's Tony Sargent has been camped out in Houston, Texas. Tony, what's the latest from Mission Control?
Gary, just a moment ago, we were able to see a little different part of the control room through our closed-circuit video monitor here, and the fellow who's running things down here plainly looked kind of relieved. He and a colleague walked over to a wall map and kind of spanned their fingers down across eastern coast of Canada, Maine, on down across the Atlantic, and plainly they were pointing with smiles on their faces to the probability that we would see an Atlantic splashdown for Skylab. Gary?
Thank you, Tony Sargent, in Houston, Texas. Stay with us for updates on the fall of Skylab.
No, it's being watched and monitored sufficiently. I don't really think we're in any danger, and I feel if they had enough control on the thing that one way or another they could have caused it to fall in a non-dangerous area, so to speak.
Battelle was on his way to work in New York. Mike Catrone was, too.
I don't want nothing falling on my head. I gotta make a living. I gotta walk out there. I don't want nothing hit me in the head while I'm walking out there.
Mike Catrone and Harvey Battelle heading for work this morning in New York City. Right.
Skylab now is looking at the Indian Ocean for what will probably be its final time. It'll proceed from there on around up across the eastern half of Australia, past the New Hebrides Islands, just north of Hawaii, and then streak across Canada. Just after that, NASA says, it will be coming down in a 4,000-mile-long array of debris, which will land in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, just the way NASA wanted to. Earlier, there was some slight possibility that some of the smaller debris might have come down somewhere near the eastern coast of North America, but now apparently even that has been ruled out, and things are looking very good. It should be all happening in about an hour and a quarter from now. That'll be about the end of the life of Skylab. Stay with us for updates on Skylab from Mission Control in Houston.
Now on what is expected to be its next to last orbit, the space station at an altitude of about 82 miles. A number of ex-Skylab astronauts have gathered in Mission Control to watch the re-entry on the tracking map there. Skylab Control reports the window for re-entry has now been narrowed to the hours of 10:09 to 12:09 this morning. There have been reports that an Air Force prediction says some of the Skylab debris is expected to hit off the coast of Nova Scotia and that some fragments could land in Canada and Maine. NASA officials say that is a slight possibility. There is a 95% possibility that Skylab will re-enter on its expected orbit 81, and that orbit flies the station over a portion of Canada and Maine. However, it is more probable that Skylab will fall at the midpoint of orbit 81, and that would mean most, if not all, of the debris would fall into the Atlantic Ocean. Glenn Moyer, WOAI News at the Manned Spacecraft Center, Houston.
CBS News. Skylab has perhaps less than an hour left to fly, and space controllers say they've given the 77-ton vehicle another 18 minutes of life, which they hope will loft its molten wreckage safely beyond populated areas. I'm Jerry Landay reporting on the CBS Radio Network. Jed Duval reports from NASA headquarters in Washington.
Skylab has just passed the coast of Australia, heading north and east toward the vicinity of Seattle, Washington. If predictions hold, the Space Lab has no more than 40 or 50 minutes left in orbit and will begin to re-enter the Earth's atmosphere at an altitude of 67 miles, just north of the U.S.-Canadian border out west. That does not necessarily pose a danger to Canadians, however, as Skylab will go 4,000 miles during re-entry before it starts shedding debris. NASA's tracking figures now indicate that, despite earlier fears that some small pieces would hit Canada and Maine, all of the space junk will fall into the Atlantic Ocean, the largest, most dangerous of them landing below the equator, 10 minutes or so after noon. This positive news of enormous relief to officials here is not certain. NASA spokesmen emphasize, as they have throughout the Skylab watch, that these are calculations, that the same fickle atmosphere which dragged down Skylab could still play a trick or two. We could, said one official, still be off by an orbit. Another set of tracking figures, times, and places is due momentarily on the final fate of Skylab. Jed Duval, CBS News at NASA headquarters in Washington.
More after this.
Here's the latest worldwide news from the American Entertainment Network. Bill Deal reporting. Skylab is heading toward a fiery end. It's now expected to enter the Earth's atmosphere soon, with a most likely time about an hour from now. Are any land areas threatened by Skylab? ABC's Tony Sargent is with us right now. Tony, what are they saying about that at Houston Mission Control?
Bill, they're saying that though Skylab does have to overfly the North American continent from point in extreme northwestern United States and on up across Canada and out across Maine, that in fact that landmass is no longer in any jeopardy if it ever was. And there's great doubt that it was. The odds have always been with everybody in the world, and they still are with anybody under the present final track of Skylab across North America. It's supposed to go on out into the mid-Atlantic, and it has less than an hour of life remaining, according to the present calculations. We here in Mission Control noticed that a lot of NASA employees seem to have a bit of relief on their faces. They can take some credit for having decided to tumble or cause Skylab to wobble a little earlier than they had planned, and this was a conscious decision for which they can take the credit or, on the long chance, the blame for what comes as a result of that, Bill.
Thank you, Tony Sargent, and of course we'll have more details as Skylab comes closer to crashdown. How are Americans reacting to Skylab's downfall? ABC's Martin Bush talked to some New Yorkers on their way to work this morning and asked if they were fearful that Skylab might hit New York or some other land area.
Not fearful, just doubtful.
I haven't been that worried about it, but yes, I'm relieved. However, their forecasting, they say, is not that accurate, so I'm not sure yet where it's going to fall, but I think they'll take care of it.
I just feel it's not going to hit anyone or anything. It's going to land in a deserted area, that's all.
New Yorkers reacting to Skylab's fall to Earth, now expected to come in about an hour. Hundreds of passengers were stranded this morning at airports in Turkey. Turkish officials had decided to take no chances of Skylab debris hitting Turkish airliners in flight. The planes will remain grounded until the all clear is sounded. Now this.
Glenn Moyer has been on the scene at the Manned Spacecraft Center, making sure that our listeners keep up to date on exactly what is taking place with Skylab. Glenn is on the line. We're going to him in just a very few seconds. He informs me that at the moment it looks like Skylab is very near to the end of its fate. It is, however, going to take some time from the point where Skylab is actually in the atmosphere until it impacts, and it will impact along a 4,000-mile swath. So we're not talking about something that's going to come down in one huge chunk. Stay tuned to WOAI. We're going to go now to Glenn for direct live coverage, and of course we'll be back later this afternoon when there's further information on Skylab. These special Skylab reports are being brought to you on a continuing basis by Bexar County National Bank, your Advantage Bank downtown.
Good morning. I'm Glenn Moyer at NASA's Manned Spacecraft Center here in Houston, along with George Jennings at our Skylab News Central, to bring you up to date on what has been happening here. Of course, we will be broadcasting these live reports from Houston on the progress of the Skylab crashdown. At this point, Skylab is located just over the Great Lakes region in a section of Canada. It is tracking on its final orbit. Crashdown expected sometime between 11:01 and 11:15. We have a new update coming from Skylab Control. We'll listen to that right now.
Including Dr. Christopher C. Kraft, Director of the Johnson Space Center.
Apparently, Skylab Control is informing us as to who some of the people are that we will be listening to as these reports progress. Again, Skylab is predicted to crash down at some point between the times of 11:01 this morning and 11:53. And it is currently tracking on orbit number 81. That orbit will carry the space station across the North American continent where it is located now. It's moving closer and closer to the state of Maine. It will cross over the state of Maine if all goes as planned, and then out into the central North Atlantic Ocean. Its orbit carrying it across the Atlantic Ocean in a southerly direction, just about splitting the ocean in the middle. At this point, NASA has revised their predicted re-entry point. It now is in the southern Atlantic Ocean at a point off the African coast. and if all goes as planned, that should be where Skylab will indeed break up. We should remind you at this point that there are, of course, margins of error in NASA's predictions. Earlier, about 10 or 15 minutes before we went to the air, there was a predicted re-entry point indicated just about midway in the North Atlantic. That re-entry point has been moved down considerably to the Southern Atlantic Ocean. At this point, it certainly appears that Skylab will not cause any threat to any land mass, which certainly the officials here at NASA are very, very excited about. One point we thought you might be interested in as we approach the re-entry again is exactly what will happen to Skylab. Now, the latest information we had was that Skylab, when it crossed the Goldstone Tracking Center in California, was still in one piece. It has not begun to break up. We're told that it arrived at that tracking location some 3 to 4 seconds early. We've also been in contact with Charles Harlan, who is the flight controller of Skylab here in Houston, and have covered much of the discussions, or much of our discussion with Mr. Harlan, of course, concerns what will happen during the re-entry phase. And earlier, Mr. Harlan talked with us about the process that Skylab will go through once it begins to break up, and that is expected to again begin upon re-entry. And Mr. Harlan explained that for us. We thought you'd like to be informed as well as to what will happen. Here is, again, Charles Harlan. He is the flight controller of Skylab here in Houston.
We think that about 65 nautical miles, the panels are going to come off. All the solar panels. And they're going to come loose and break off. And then the next thing that's going to happen somewhere below 50 nautical miles, maybe 55, 58, 55, somewhere in that range. But between 50 and 60 nautical miles, this big mass that's up here, the Apollo telescope mount, that's going to separate from the vehicle. So then it becomes two entry bodies at that point. So the Apollo telescope mount assumes its own trajectory because it has a different mass and a little different area and so forth, different general ballistic coefficient. And this workshop assumes its own trajectory then. There are two separate pieces there. And the panels are floated off somewhere else, falling away. And then as the altitude gets below about 50 nautical miles, the heating is really high on the vehicle end. And as the heating is high, and then probably in a 45 to 50 nautical mile range, these two independent bodies start coming apart. And then they come apart in pieces, a multitude of which tend to act independently like these two big pieces did. You know, they're different shapes, different densities and so forth, so they take their own trajectories, and that's how that 4,000 nautical mile path or footprint was built up by someone doing some analysis.
That 4,000-mile footprint that Mr. Harlan is talking about is the path that will be left or along which the debris from Skylab will fall. Now, according to the latest tracking map, which has just disappeared from our monitors, we're now seeing a number of ex-Skylab astronauts gathered in mission control. But if all goes as planned and Skylab makes its crash down in the South Atlantic Ocean, the debris would be spread along a point, along an orbital path that swings very close to the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, and then back through the Indian Ocean, and the debris should fall along that path for a period or a distance of about 4,000 nautical miles. So there might be some chance that the debris would fall in South Africa, but at this point, that appears to be the only landmass that might bear any threat from falling Skylab debris.
Glenn, once again, for those listeners just joining us, can you tell us exactly what the status is of Skylab at this very moment?
At this moment, Skylab has, it's just now disappeared off of the tracking map, but just before they took that picture down from us, we had seen where Skylab has moved completely across the North American continent. So if NASA's predictions are correct, there will not be any falling debris to hit into Canada or Maine or the Nova Scotia areas. There were earlier reports this morning. It now appears Skylab is holding together and apparently will break up over the South Atlantic Ocean.
Skylab now is out over the North Atlantic. It has cleared the North American continent, passed over Canada several minutes ago, and the Bermuda tracking station did have acquisition on it. That means that it was still intact when it went by the Bermuda tracking station. It's now heading on down through the Atlantic on what should be its final orbit, and They will have another chance to get a look at it as it goes over the Ascension Island tracking station. That's in the South Atlantic between South America and Africa. It has cleared the threat of landing on North America, and it's expected to go on down and land in oceans between here and Australia, but NASA is now reviewing the data to see if there's any chance that it might hold up much longer than expected, giving it any chance to get on around there toward Australia and the East Indies. Stay with us for updates on Skylab from Mission Control in Houston.
CBS News. Skylab is in its final orbit of the Earth. I'm Ed Bradley reporting on the CBS radio network. With the latest details, here's Eric Ingberg in Houston.
The Skylab space station, now in its last hour of life, has passed over the United States, still intact, and is now in the Atlantic Ocean off the west coast of Africa. NASA expects the spacecraft, as it enters the Earth's atmosphere, to heat up, then break apart and scatter debris. It now appears from the latest tracking information that debris will go into the ocean. Here is the latest from Skylab Control.
Approximately 42 statute miles as it comes within range of the Ascension tracking station.
That a report from the Skylab Control at Mission Control Headquarters here at the Houston Space Center, that Skylab's altitude now 35 nautical miles and coming within range of the Ascension tracking station in the Atlantic. The indications from Ascension will be the first we will have as to whether the Skylab is still intact, still in one piece, or whether it has started to fall apart. Once NASA knows whether it has started to fall apart, then some information can be gleaned about the debris pattern, which is expected to travel across a 4,000-mile long path, 100 miles wide. This is Eric Ingberg, CBS News, at the Johnson Space Center.
More CBS News in a minute.
The map started moving, stopped moving just a few minutes ago. It had been moving down through the Atlantic. It had come across Canada. Let's listen now to Skylab Control.
On schedule time, indicating the vehicle was still sending signals to the tracking station. Flight Director Charles Holland estimates that the vehicle, although it went through the Ascension tracking station in one piece, it has lost some of its solar panels during the pass or prior to it. This is based on the fact that during the Ascension pass, we did lose telemetry.
What this means, apparently, is that Skylab is...
Telemetry was intermittent during the Ascension pass.
NASA seems to be indicating that Skylab has begun to break up, but quite a bit later than they expected it would. They thought it would begin breaking up as it passed over the North American continent, or just afterward. That would have thrown all of the space debris out into the Atlantic, the North Atlantic, the Mid-Atlantic. They'd have been happy either way. Now it is just running a little late, and they would like to see this thing get on down there as it passes south of Africa and swings east through the Indian Ocean. The next land mass that would be in any jeopardy at all is the continent of Australia, if Skylab is still up for that long. Doubtful that it will be, but if it does go across Australia, it'll be on a course that will take it up through what my geography, if I recall it correctly, over these many years, would be the Australian outback. Not too many Australians living out there, but it is land. That means there is some very remote chance that somebody would be in jeopardy if it would be in the air that long. Again, it's very doubtful because Skylab is starting to break up, but just it's not quite decaying, as they say here, as fast as they had hoped it would. The solar panels are off, but there's still a telescope mount, one of the major pieces of hardware on that Skylab apparatus, to break off. We have not yet received any confirmation that that has occurred. And then beyond that, of course, there are some large chunks as well as some small ones that have to fall into the sea, either the South Atlantic or the Indian Ocean, as it continues in what was to have been its final orbit and probably will be. We're looking up at our bulletin board here, and we see that the altitude indicator has gone completely out. and there will be no tracking from this point. Skylab has reached a point now at which the radar stations cannot see it. Here's mission control.
AM Central Daylight Time. NORAD reports to flight controllers in Houston that during the ascension pass, they estimated the altitude of the vehicle to be approximately 110 kilometers or 69 statute miles. Earlier numbers passed on the release line were those estimated at the control center based on the projected entry of Skylab. Currently, through the ascension pass, the altitude is 69 statute miles.
So there we have NASA admitting that things are just a little behind schedule here at 69 statute miles. That was a while ago. The real breakup of Skylab, we calculate here, would occur at about 46 statute miles. At this point, it should be descending very rapidly.
We here at the Johnson Space Center do not expect any further signal from Skylab. It is out of range of all of the tracking stations, and it's on its final descent.
From here, we are able...
information will be passed out as we receive it from NORAD.
From here, we are able to see on a video monitor just over to the far corner of our room a little view of the corner of the control room there, and we see that there are no smiles. They're working very busily, at least several of them are, trying to project what may be going on. Now they feel a bit blind, I suppose, based on what we have just heard. Earlier, we did see some people walking over to a map on the wall and placing their hands at a point on in the Australia area, even a little north of that, in the East Indies. That would be the next landmass that Skylab would be overflying if it should happen to be in the air still at that point. Again, those are very long odds. They are not quite as long as the originally stated odds for anyone on Earth being damaged or hurt by Skylab. Those were 150 to 1, and I suppose they still hold, especially on this thinly populated track, this orbit that Skylab is now flying through to what we think and hope here at Mission Control will be its death. As for your individual odds on being hurt by Skylab, and these two are probably greater now, but it's somewhat reassuring to reflect that those were calculated by a professional outfit that's involved in such things as being 1 in 600 billion. That should be some consolation to you, especially since Skylab in its decaying form has to pass all the way through a couple of the world's major oceans before it gets back toward the North American continent. The room is a lot more quiet here now. Earlier we had noticed a pickup in activity as some of the NASA people came out from places backstage and seemed not jubilant, but a little relieved until they recently had to admit that Skylab was behind schedule in its descent and its decay. The last location was over Ascension Island, or in that area. That's between South America and Africa. We will be staying here. Here is
through Ascension
Skylab Control.
With no longer any capability of NASA to track the vehicle. We will bring the line down at this time at 14 minutes after the hour and come back up as we have additional information from NORAD. At 11:14 a.m. Central Daylight Time, this is Skylab Control.
Skylab Control there with the latest information. Of course, we'll be staying here to keep you apprised, so be sure to stay with us for updates on Skylab from Mission Control in Houston.
We were with the vehicle at about 12:10. It was last reported an altitude of 57 miles. Then everything went dead. We can only conclude that Skylab died a watery death, huge pieces falling harmlessly in the South Atlantic. We get a better idea when the Kwajalein tracking station in the Pacific tries to pick her up. No signals will mean she's down, and R.I.P. Dick Rossay, NASA headquarters in Washington.
Thank you, Dick. The next generation of American spacecraft won't repeat Skylab's fate. Space shuttles will be capable of returning to Earth and landing on an airstrip. This is News from Mutual Radio. I'm Dan Scanlon.
Breeze again. 42 degrees. 87 minutes south, 105 degrees, 97 minutes east in the southern Indian Ocean, southwest the coast of Australia.
And as you just heard a moment ago, those figures have been confirmed that the degree announcement, that the location announcement just given was the farthermost point of the footprint where the heavier pieces fell. The smaller pieces fell some 4,000 miles down the track. So apparently all land mass escaped any of the return of Skylab. We will have a complete and final report on the death of Skylab on the midday report in about 15 minutes. I'm Ben Baldwin, live from Johnson Space Center.
Almost 10 minutes, maybe a little more. And that the lighter pieces are scattered back range, as they call that. In other words, towards Africa. So that the news here from NORAD and NASA is that the whole thing fell in the ocean and nobody got hurt. Eric? Chris?
Eric, at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, one of the interesting things that I noticed here was that there was no display of emotion by the flight controllers at the Mission Control Center at all when that happy news came. In past space missions, when they terminate in the ocean, we have been used to the ritualistic displaying of cigars and American flags and cheers and whistles, but this time there was nothing of that kind, just a calm acceptance and perhaps a few shrugs of relief. The director of the Johnson Space Center, Christopher Kraft, who himself directed many of America's famed space missions to success, is in the room now with many of the top executives of the space program. And neither he nor any of the people who work for him, many of whom devoted long hours in recent weeks to trying to keep the Skylab alive, indicated any great joy. It was more a sense of relief. Chris?
So, Skylab's mission, which began in May of 1973, looks like it's all over. The spacecraft pieces, those that survived the fire of re-entry, landing in the Indian Ocean off the southwest coast of Australia, and the mission ending within the parameters of the last prediction that the Space Agency scientists made for the final decay of the orbit and the re-entry through the atmosphere and the breakup. Nobody was hurt, nothing was hit. Skylab has ended. This has been a CBS News special report on the fall of Skylab, and I'm Christopher Glenn, CBS News in New York.
CBS News, a safe, watery grave for Skylab, no hits, no errors. I'm Jerry Landy reporting on the CBS Radio Network. Correspondent Jed Duval reports from NASA's Skylab headquarters in Washington. The Skylab story has ended mostly with a splash, just about the way the owners and operators of the largest space vehicle ever launched wanted it to. Over the past 24 hours, the space station, calmly falling in orbit, took its earthbound sponsors for a ride, as tracking indicated it would land first in the Atlantic, then the South Pacific, then the Indian Ocean, and for a while there was concern for parts of Canada and the U.S., specifically Seattle and Maine in the corners. And just as the space trackers had predicted, Skylab did not reveal itself until the last, hiding its whereabouts, as it lasted longer than expected, zooming down the Atlantic, around the Cape of Good Hope, where no radar, no tracking station could sense it, and then plunging most of it into the water a few hundred miles off the southwestern tip of Australia. And true to its pattern of mystery, to the last, Skylab has apparently dropped a number of fragments on some of the smaller towns in that country's far southwest. From reports still being checked, places like Kalgoorlie, for example, have 20 or so pieces. NASA has reported that the heaviest pieces of Skylab fell safely into the Indian Ocean far away. Jed Duval, CBS News at NASA headquarters in Washington. More after this.
News Director Ben Baldwin is standing by at the Johnson Space Center, along with NASA spokesman Charles Redmond. We go to him now for this live report on Skylab.
Thank you, Nora. Right, no hits, but maybe almost an error. In fact, Skylab came dangerously close to the coast of Australia. About 25 minutes ago, it was officially announced that Skylab had completed re-entry and that it was down in the ocean. It was about 5 minutes later that we got this report from NASA Command in Washington.
reports of some sightings of fragments which may be related to Skylab reentry. These have been reported from Kalgoorlie Airport in Australia, Perth Airport, Esperance, and Albany in Australia. We will keep you appraised as new information develops. This is Skylab Coordination Center in Washington.
Then about 5 minutes later, KTRH newsman Bob Wright talked to Australian radio, and there we interviewed a man who watched Skylab fall.
We've seen about uncounted numbers, say somewhere between 50 and 100 pieces carrying on a northeasterly direction from here.
How high did it look to be up in the sky?
Your guess is as good as mine, but it would probably be, well, anywhere to 50,000 feet. We wouldn't know. There's nothing to compare it with.
How big were these pieces, would you say?
Oh, quite bright lights in the sky.
Did they take long to pass over?
No, they were passing over fairly quickly. I would say a minute and a half and they'd be out of sight.
Were there long streaks of light in the sky?
There was a sonic boom here also. The boom came about 3 minutes behind the light.
The boom came about 3 minutes behind the light. Charles Redmond, NASA PIO spokesman, it was indeed a successful re-entry, but wasn't it awfully close?
Yes, Ben, I think you're right. I think we would have preferred had it come in further west in the Indian Ocean or even the South Atlantic. And Australia, we knew that Australia would be in the re-entry window. The North American Air Defense Command prediction included part of the Australian subcontinent, but we did not really expect any material to come over Australia.
Okay.
According to the latest Defense Department estimate of where the forward end of that re-entry footprint was, it was about...
That's when the larger pieces came down.
Right. That was about 1,000 miles off the southwest coast. Very close, actually, to Perth and Albany and Esperance. And in fact, what they described, the sonic boom, that was one of the kinds of things that might happen under varying conditions. So it sounds very much like perhaps a few fragments might have made it even further towards Australia than the Air Force prediction.
Okay, now you heard the eyewitness description from Australia. As far as I know, it's the first time an eyewitness description has been broadcast to the United States now. After all, we're only about 30 minutes after re-entry.
Very soon, you're right.
And it sounds as though that what the man saw was indeed Skylab.
It does sound that way, and if there are any sightings over land, if any of the people in Australia find material like that, we would be extremely interested in knowing the location where they fell, because of course that would enable us to refine the predictions we use for this kind of thing for future events like this.
Was there a possible mistake made in that last-minute maneuver to prolong the life of Skylab? I mean, it almost prolonged it a bit too long.
Well, if you look at the possibilities of where Skylab could have come in over, the maneuver was performed to have the Skylab re-enter over the Atlantic Ocean rather than further west, say over the Pacific or over the Indian Ocean. That put the United States and Canada, the North American continent, out of the areas of possible landfall for the Skylab re-entry. Australia itself was in for one and possibly one half of an orbit over. So what we did, apparently, was shift the risk from North America forwards along the track, and it was our expectation that all of the material would fall in the Atlantic Ocean, with some of it in the Indian Ocean. What happened, obviously, is that we shifted it even further forward into the Indian Ocean, towards Australia, with none of it apparently coming into the South Atlantic.
Now, we have reports that the breakup actually started after losing communications through the Ascension tracking station. And then the breakup probably got really underway, the full-fledged breakup, if you can call it that, around the Cape of Good Horn. Is that right?
That's probably correct. Yeah. And by the time that material started coming in, it would have been south of Madagascar, heading up towards Australia. And that is roughly the 4,000-mile footprint that we have been talking about.
All right, when it looked as though that there was going to be a problem, that maybe there was going to be a problem, that maybe it had been extended too far, were efforts made to contact the Australian government at that time?
I'm sure they were. We were not involved with that here at the Johnson Space Center. The State Department, as you know, was part of the Skylab Coordination Center in Washington. Here at the News Center, we have received an awful lot of phone calls from Australian media, as I think KTRH has themselves. So the Australians obviously have been informed, and it was the intent of the United States government all along to use the State Department to inform foreign governments. So it looks like they probably were advised.
How would you characterize the success of this particular mission?
I think we're very fortunate that the orbit that it came in on is one of the best possible orbits it could have come in on. I think after so many things which have gone wrong in our attempts to reduce the risk of Skylab's reentering, that it was perhaps fortuitous that things went right for a change. And obviously we're all very relieved that it's over.
Charles Redmond, thank you very much for being with us. Charles Redmond, NASA Public Information Specialist. Bob, you have some more of that information that we had from Australian radio, right?
Yes, I talked with David Margan. Actually, this started last night when Australian radio called us here at the KTRH desk wanting information on what was happening with Skylab. All during the night, the Australian people, as Charles mentioned, were calling here. They were very worried about Skylab, and we were kind of curious as to why they were so worried about it, but they had plotted it out with their own scientists and with their own technicians, and they thought there was a very good chance that portions of Skylab would come down either very near their country or in it. And I talked with David Margan, who is program director for the Australian Broadcasting Company.
Let me ask you a few questions. Are you getting very many calls and reports from Western Australia on sightings like this?
Well, communication is very difficult in this country because of its size, and particularly because at the moment we're having a telecommunications strike. Our only contact with Western Australia at the moment is via our reporter in Perth, who is feverishly contacting areas to the southwest of Perth, from where he gained that last report.
So you haven't heard of any injuries or anything like that, or actually no objects actually hitting the ground in Australia?
No, so far not as yet. It seems actually a bit confusing in that objects passing overhead and yet an impact point in the ocean some distance from the Western Australian coast. We are expecting at any time to have some more details from the Canberra Operations Centre, which is the capital of the country. But as yet, we have no further details.
And I spoke with him, I guess, Ben, probably 11 minutes ago. Okay. So, we're still, we're still within impact, the hour of impact.
Yeah, 35 minutes away. We heard impact, and about 2 minutes ago, you heard, as far as we know, the first eyewitness broadcast in the United States of the return and the final leg and the death of Skylab. I'm Ben Bolton, along with Bob Wright, live from the Johnson Space Center.
Here's the latest worldwide news from the American Entertainment Network. John Degnan reporting. Skylab is down in the Indian Ocean southwest of Australia, and ABC's Tony Sargent is standing by at NASA Mission Control in Houston. Tony, what's the latest on Skylab?
John, the latest is that it's down and that NASA is very relieved about it, because overnight NASA made the decision to tumble Skylab a little early to make sure it would kick its way across the North American continent on its final orbit, that it would land at least in the Atlantic, maybe a little farther along toward the Indian Ocean. Well, it did get to the Indian Ocean before it broke up completely, strewed its debris over a 4,000-mile stretch of the Indian Ocean, about 100 miles wide, and some of those big chunks got as far east as Australia. In other words, if Skylab had gone a little bit farther, we might have had some indignation from our friends down under. As it was, they got quite an interesting sighting in some cases. An air controller at the Perth airport, for example. I understand we're going to hear from him a little later. It must have been quite a show down there. I'm kind of sorry I was here in this room instead of out where I could see it, John.
Thanks, Tony. ABC's Tony Sargent at NASA Mission Control in Houston. So, reported there have been sightings of fragments in Australia. Most of the reports coming from airports. Julius Ripley is an air controller at Perth Airport in southwest Australia.
What I saw was a greenish and blue light midway, just looking down to the southeast of Perth Airport, and it transversed the sky towards the northeast, that period of time, it changed from orange to amber light. And stretched between about 2 to 3 miles in length across the sky.
Julius Ripley at Perth Airport. Again, Skylab has come down in the Indian Ocean southwest of Australia. Now this. Reports of damage or injuries. Airport traffic controller Julian Ridley in Perth saw it.
We've just had some fog at the field, and those low stratus were starting to lift. And I had this initial flash of light from the southeast that turned out then to become a very fiery amber mass.
There were dozens of sightings in Australia. Another man in Perth said there was no sound, just long streaks of very bright lights, like a train in the sky. In the United States, commercial airliners were kept briefly out of the airspace over Maine and along a corridor 150 miles wide from Seattle, Washington to Norfolk, Virginia, as a precaution. In Augusta, Maine, Leslie Higgins of the Office of Civil Preparedness says his staff found out a lot during the Skylab alert.
One thing that we learned was the fact that we can depend upon people when the need for those people is actually present. I don't think people like to get involved in drills or simulations or things that they personally consider deep down inside are a waste of time.
And in Houston, Charles Harlan of NASA says Skylab was not a flimsy piece of equipment.
I think we in the control center were amazed at the toughness of the spacecraft to hang together there at the altitude that it was at over Bermuda.
Harlan in Houston says scientists thought the Skylab solar panels would have burned off much earlier. Skylab dead after 34,981 trips around the Earth.